Stabilize the amniotic sequence. We are bringing it back to life.
Somewhere in northern Spain right now, a cat that was declared functionally extinct just over 20 years ago is teaching its kittens how to hunt rabbits in the exact same scrubland its ancestors vanished from. In 2002, there were fewer than 100 Iberian lynx left on the entire planet. Today, there are over 2,000. That's not a rounding error, and it's not one lucky season. That's one of the fastest wildcat recoveries ever documented. And it's not even the biggest comeback story happening on Earth right now. If you'd asked a conservation biologist 20 years ago whether nature could actually claw back ground it had already lost, most of them would have told you no. Habitat doesn't grow back on its own. Populations that collapse that far don't usually recover. And yet, heading into 2027, something is shifting on a scale that's catching even the experts off guard. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why some of the animals we'd quietly written off are suddenly showing up again in places nobody expected. For most of the last century, the story of wildlife on this planet has been one long retreat, and it's worth sitting with how steep that retreat actually was before we talk about the recovery. Forests were cleared for farmland at a pace that outstripped anything in prior human history. Rivers were dammed and rerouted, cutting migration routes that species had used for thousands of generations. Predators in particular were hunted out of entire regions, partly out of fear, partly because they competed with livestock for space and were treated as a problem to be solved rather than an animal to be managed. By the 1970s and 80s, the damage had compounded to the point where entire species existed only in isolated pockets. A few hundred wolves clinging to remote mountain ranges, whale populations gutted by nearly a century of industrial-scale commercial hunting, bison reduced from tens of millions of animals roaming the continent to a few hundred individuals scattered across private ranches. The working assumption baked into most environmental reporting for decades was simple and, frankly, pretty bleak. Things get worse, and the best anyone can realistically hope for is slowing the decline. That assumption is now being tested in real time, in multiple places, across multiple species, and the early results are hard to argue with. Start with the gray wolf in Western Europe, because this one defies almost everyone's expectations about how recovery is supposed to work. For most of the 20th century, wolves were essentially erased from the region, hunted to extinction in Germany, France, and much of Central Europe by the mid-1900s, with only small, isolated populations surviving in remote parts of Italy and the Balkans. Nobody was planning for their return. There was no large-scale reintroduction program dropping wolves back into these countries. But strict legal protections, paired with the slow return of forest cover across parts of the continent as farming consolidated elsewhere, gave wolves an opening nobody had actually engineered. They simply walked back in. Young wolves dispersed from those surviving pockets, crossed borders that hadn't seen a wild wolf in generations, and started re-establishing packs in regions that hadn't heard a howl in over 100 years. Current estimates put the European wolf population at well over 20,000 animals, spread across nearly every country on the continent, including places like Belgium and the Netherlands, where their return has occasionally made front-page news simply because nobody alive had ever seen one there. Farmers aren't thrilled about it, and the tension between conservation and livestock protection is real and ongoing. But biologically, this is one of the most dramatic large predator recoveries ever recorded without a deliberate reintroduction program driving it. A species that essentially recolonized a continent on its own, simply because the pressure that had erased it finally lifted. Then there's the humpback whale, and this might be the single most staggering number in this entire story. Commercial whaling brought some humpback populations down to less than 5% of their historic size by the mid-1900s. Not a decline, a near-total collapse across entire ocean basins, the kind of number that made extinction feel less like a risk and more like an inevitability. After the international whaling moratorium took hold in the 1980s, populations that scientists had genuinely written off as unlikely to ever recover started climbing, slowly at first, then dramatically. Off the eastern coast of South America, one humpback population has rebounded from roughly 450 individuals in the 1950s to well over 25,000 today. Read that number again, because it's not a slow trickle back towards stability. It's one of the most complete recoveries of a large marine mammal population ever recorded, achieved in less than a single human lifetime, simply by removing the one factor that was driving the collapse in the first place. And it's not just the headline species carrying this story. The pattern shows up in places most people never think to look. American bison, once reduced to a few hundred animals after near total extermination across the 1800s, now number in the tens of thousands across protected grasslands and tribal lands, with several indigenous nations in North America leading major bison restoration efforts aimed not just at rebuilding the ecosystem, but at restoring cultural and spiritual practices tied to the animal for thousands of years before European colonization. Sea otters along stretches of the Pacific coast are quietly rebuilding entire underwater ecosystems just by existing in greater numbers again. Otters keep sea urchin populations in check, and without that pressure, urchins strip kelp forests bare. So the otter's comeback isn't just an otter story, it's a kelp forest story, a fish nursery story, a carbon storage story, all riding on the back of one predator's return. And then there's the mountain gorilla, a species that was projected by some researchers in the 1980s to be extinct by the early 2000s. Instead, thanks to intensive community-involved conservation work across the Virunga Mountains spanning Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the population has more than doubled since the 1980s, becoming one of the only great ape populations on the planet currently trending upward instead of down. Here's the moment that actually puts the scale of all this in perspective, though. And it's the part that turns a handful of individually impressive stories into something bigger. If you mapped every one of these recoveries onto a single world map, wolves reclaiming forest corridors across Europe, humpbacks refilling ocean basins in the southern hemisphere, lynx spreading back across the Iberian Peninsula, bison herds expanding across North American grassland, otters rebuilding kelp forests along the Pacific coast, gorillas climbing back from the edge in Central Africa, you're not looking at a handful of isolated wins scattered randomly across the planet. You're looking at a pattern showing up on nearly every continent, across wildly different ecosystems, climates, and species, all trending in the same direction at roughly the same time. That's the detail that's hard to write off as coincidence. Recoveries this geographically spread out, happening in parallel rather than in isolation, usually point to something structural changing underneath all of them, rather than just a string of lucky individual outcomes. So what's actually driving it? It's rarely just one factor, and it's worth breaking apart because each piece explains a different chunk of the pattern. Legal protection is a huge part of it. Hunting bans, habitat protections, and international agreements like the whaling moratorium removed the single biggest pressure that was driving several of these species toward extinction in the first place. And removing that pressure alone was often enough to let a population start climbing on its own. Rewilding projects deserve real credit too. Deliberate efforts to reintroduce keystone species and then step back, letting ecosystems rebuild themselves from the ground up rather than trying to manage every piece by hand indefinitely. And there's a slower, harder to quantify factor sitting underneath all of it. Public attitudes have genuinely shifted over the past few decades. Farmers, governments, and local communities that once saw predators purely as threats to livestock and livelihood have increasingly moved toward coexistence strategies. Compensation programs for livestock losses, non-lethal deterrence, ecotourism revenue tied directly to the presence of these animals rather than their absence. When a community has an actual economic and cultural reason to want a species around, recovery tends to accelerate in a way that legal protection alone can't fully achieve, because the incentive stops being purely regulatory and starts being personal. Now, none of this means the picture is uniformly rosy, and it's worth being honest about that before wrapping this up. Plenty of species are still sliding in the wrong direction. Insect populations globally are under serious pressure. Coral reefs remain in crisis in many parts of the world, and climate change hasn't gone away just because a handful of high-profile recoveries are making headlines. Some of these comeback stories are also more fragile than the raw numbers suggest. A wolf population that's recovered on paper can still be vulnerable to a shift in political will or a bad hunting season if protections get rolled back. So this isn't a story about nature fixing itself automatically. It's a story about what happens specifically when legal protection, habitat, and public attitude all move in the same direction at once. And the fact that it's happened repeatedly across continents with wildly different species suggests that the model itself is worth paying attention to, not just celebrating as a one-off. Heading into 2027, the wolves, whales, lynx, bison, otters, and gorillas tell a version of this story that would have sounded like wishful thinking a generation ago. That decline isn't automatically permanent, and that given the right combination of legal protection, restored habitat, and genuine public buy-in, some of the animals we assumed we'd already lost can still find their way back to places we thought were closed to them for good. Which comeback surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the wildlife stories actually worth being hopeful about, subscribe for what's coming next.